This episode of The Clear Out was recorded on the 21st of November 2023 at home in Wicklow, and it is an episode inspired by, propelled by, catalysed by International Men's Day, which I didn't even realise was on. So I sort of respond to that and try to contextualise that. And it leads me to two or three major talking points in the episode. One of which is a 1971 movie about sexual politics, and in particular the male perspective on women and sex. And it's a movie that still holds up really well today, with some very good acting, great and some great dialogue, a very good script. So that's one. Two is my response to a tweet from someone I know, and his sort of exhortation or recommendation for the three things men should reflect on International Men's Day. And my response to that leads me to the third thing I talk about today, which is the value or not of atonement. And I try to look at what atonement means to whom. So that's what's coming up. I hope you find it engaging, diverting, entertaining, and any other positive ings. I'll see you around the corner. Cheers.
Ooh, not gonna change my mind, leaving the dream behind, keep my emoji inside.
Hi, my name is Dara Clear, and you're listening to The Clear Out. You're very welcome. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for choosing this podcast, which is my podcast. So in a way, you've chosen me. And that's all I'm here for. I'm just here to satisfy a deep, primal need to be chosen. And listen, if you want to do some more choosing, if this podcast is your thing or one of your things, if you like the way I treat life's challenges, mental health, personal responsibility, personal philosophy, self-care, and all that kind of thing, you can become a friend of the podcast at patreon.com/theclearout. And for the price of a sandwich or a cup of tea or a couple of bars of chocolate, depending on what your thing is, you can support me and endorse and validate this independent podcast. And believe me, you don't have to believe me, but I'm just going to say it anyway. Believe me, I would be very grateful. That stuff really is meaningful. It does mean something. It's a token of faith, and more than a mere token, because of course it is a financial commitment to this thing that I do. So that's it. Otherwise, all the usual social media challenges. That something a bit Freudian about that. Social media channels are challenging. On all the social media platforms, you can throw me a bit of love, a comment, a review, rate. You can subscribe, all of that sort of stuff. And I am expecting finally, the new improved website for The Clear Out should be up and running very, very soon. So I'm looking forward to being able to share that with you. Okay, let's get on with it. So I have one main theme on my mind for this week's episode, which I'm going to try and keep this one under an hour if possible. I rarely succeed in keeping it under an hour. But I have a few errands to run after recording, so I need to get my butt out the door about an hour from now. So I'll see if I can it's not that I don't stay on point. It just feels like there's always something else to say. There's always another valence to be considered, another facet to look at. But before I get to my main thing, International Men's Day was last Sunday, the 19th of November. And it passed without note, without incident. In my life anyway, I'm not sure about elsewhere. I didn't even realise it was International Men's Day, I think, until late Sunday night. And I'm not sure if I'm just looking in the wrong places, or I don't know anyone who cares about these things. I feel, and this is not a dig. I'm not firing shots here, but I feel when it's International Women's Day, I know all about it, and that's not from my wife. Just in case you're jumping to conclusions there, I just feel that the presence of that event, the call for acknowledgement, is much more there. And I had no sense of I had no sense of it being International Men's Day. And I feel like an international man, because that's what was being celebrated. Am I right? International men. If you weren't an international man, it wasn't your day. Okay, you know and I know that's not what they were celebrating, okay? We were just celebrating men. Now, as it happens, a couple of months ago at this stage, I think, if you were listening, you may recall I mentioned in one episode this idea I had for real men headlines, and my impulse behind this concept was to sort of introduce a counter narrative or a celebration of just normal everyday men who aren't contributing to the negative narratives around men in the world at the moment. And that this is not a way to deny or quieten down causes for concern. In no way is this meant to, distract from serious issues around male behaviour, culturally, socially, whatever it might be. That is not my proposal. My proposal is, let's not lose sight that a lot of men are just living their lives in the most normal ways and just doing good things within their, and again, inverted commas, their normal lives as partners, as family members, as parents, work colleagues, volunteers, people involved in different organisations, clubs, societies, etc. So I'll just mention, and again, it's not to, again, I can't stress enough, there's a mundanity to these things, an everydayness to these things that is probably not in any way remarkable. But that's kind of my point. So for example, I'll just throw this one out there, and it involves me. I may as well start with myself. It involves me. On Saturday night, I spent the night with my cousin Cormac, Harry Cormac. I don't know if you listen to the show, The Tell. We had been planning a boys' night. Dun, dun, dun. And all the women shudder, or all the women snicker. Snicker or snigger? I think they're both good options. But there's a general female eye roll. It's a boys' night. Anyway, our boys' night consisted of sitting in his kitchen, eating a lovely roast chicken dinner and lovely vegetables made by him, drinking a little but not a lot of wine, and having as our guests for our boys' night our 3 daughters, as in that we don't share them. His 2 daughters and my 1 daughter. And we had dinner, and then we played Monopoly, and we hung out with the girls. And then we stayed up for about an hour or so after the girls went to bed and had a bit of chat, and then that was it. That was the boys' night. So there was nothing nefarious. There was nothing sneaky. There was nothing underhand. And it was kind of nice to go, I don't know how much of this was happening in the previous generation. And again, I'm not here to disparage or cast aspersions on, the fathers of my father's generation, but it did feel like, okay, this is a shift, isn't it? Is it? Am I mad? You tell me. But there was a part of me that had been really looking forward to the night being just he and I hanging out, chatting, going deep, and whatever we wanted to talk about. But then when I reflected, I was like, God, that was actually really nice. 3 daughters just really happy to be hanging out with their fathers, and it was just kind of lovely. And there was a lovely interchange between all parties involved. And I got to have a road trip with my daughter. I mean, it was only up to Dublin from Wicklow, so we're talking about an hour in the car. But I find my daughter to be a great little travelling companion, even though she was kind of giddy and hyper on the Sunday, driving back down, and was driving me demented. But we had a good laugh. So there you go. That was my real man headline. 2 fathers spend Saturday night with daughters eating dinner and playing Monopoly. Everyone gets to bed on time. Boom. Okay, yeah, there you go. So that was, let me just put that there as an international man's moment. Okay, we're both international men. My cousin and I, we both lived overseas. We both lived in Melbourne at the same time for about the same amount of time, approximately 10 years. We sort of underlapped or overlapped by 6 months to a year, I think. But yeah, we've spent time abroad. Our outlook is international. That is a thing. Do you ever consider that? Because maybe you say international and we suspect or we think it must mean Austin Powers, international man of mystery, James Bond, espionage, or jet setters, work that takes you all over the world. Maybe you're a person of international influence. Maybe you're a leader of a nation in your mind. But international, I think it's an outlook, and it's maybe, I don't know what the opposite is. I guess the way I'm thinking of it is the opposite might be somewhere in the area of parochial or inward looking rather than outward looking. And it's not to imply a sort of egotistical sophistication. I'm not trying to adopt that or suggest that comes with it. Simply more an openness. And if I return to that idea, if I place that idea at the centre of International Men's Day, being open to the shared male experience, I think that's the point of connectivity, and I think that would be the case for International Women's Day as well. That extraordinary sisterhood of women with whom we share this planet, and it would be nice if there was confidence for maybe some female voices to say, yeah, that extraordinary brotherhood with whom we share the planet, because it's not all doom and gloom, even though if we go looking, it's easy to find the stories that scare us or confront us or make us feel let down. So two things to bump on from that. I was watching recently Mike Nichols, the American movie director of Working Girl. I'm very fond of that movie. But I was watching his 1971 movie, Carnal Knowledge. Are you familiar with that one? So Carnal Knowledge, I guess, was sort of groundbreaking at the time. It was a very frank look at male sexual mores, sexual norms, and it featured Jack Nicholson and Art Garfunkel as two college buddies, and follows them from college age into middle age, and through their relationships and their male lens on love, on sex, on women. And it ages really well. And before I forget, let me just mention the actresses involved. So the two actresses who featured most heavily in it were Candice Bergen and Anne Margaret. And then there are smaller roles for Rita Moreno and Cynthia O'Neill and Carol Kane, who you might know as the fisticuff boxing fairy from Bill Murray's version of A Christmas Carol, Scrooged. I'm not sure what else you'd know Carol Kane from. I can't think. I always know who Carol Kane is, but I can't particularly place her. And I often feel I confuse her with Bernadette Peters, just maybe because of the long, blonde, curly hair. They are not the same at all. Anyway, that is a movie that is really interesting to look at. I mean, there are aspects of it that are dated, but the acting is uniformly very good. I think Candice Bergen's character is maybe not written as well as the other characters. I'm trying to think who the playwright was. Was it Jules Pfeiffer? Have I got that right? It's very theatrical, and even the staging of the scenes is quite theatrical. You could see it all playing out on stage, and it's quite monologue-y, and there are times when each of Jack Nicholson and Art Garfunkel are looking directly into the camera, even though they're in conversation with each other. And obviously that was a deliberate choice by Nichols, probably to invite us into the male mind. And I mean, I did an episode on this not that long ago in the wake of the Russell Brand scandal, or sexual assault allegations, and spoke about this idea of the compartmentalization of male sexual desire. And this movie really looks at that very frankly. It's a lovely Jack Nicholson performance in its quieter moments. He does get to do some of the kind of more histrionic Jack Nicholson stuff. Anne Margaret is very good as well. There's just one great scene between Jack Nicholson and Anne Margaret after they've slept together, and she's in bed with the blanket covering her chest, but sort of smouldering. It's the day after, the night before. He's naked, sitting on an armchair in his room with a sheet covering his modesty, or preserving his modesty, and he's smoking, and he's just been very kind of cash and blasé, and on the surface very forthright about hey, I'm not making any promises here, I just want us to be really straightforward. And she's kind of smirking, grinning at him the whole time, in a very sexual way. And she's like, yeah, it's all good. And she's like, you really are a prick, aren't you? And he kind of grins, but he's a little bit taken aback. And that's the end of the scene. It is brilliant. And for that scene alone, the movie's worth watching, in my opinion. Jack Nicholson, his character in it is just an absolute dog. He is a complete misogynist. He's a complete sort of, perpetual bachelor. Art Garfunkel reminded me a bit of Jesse Eisenberg from The Social Network fame. And yeah, I thought he was actually very good. I mean, the only other movie I can think of him being in was a Nick Rogue thriller from around 1980 with Harvey Keitel and Teresa Russell, I think, set in Berlin maybe. I've gone blank on the name of that movie though. Bad Influence or something? I'm not sure, I can't remember the name. Sort of a psychosexual thriller. I think Keitel plays a German police officer in that. But Art Garfunkel's character is more the romantic, a bit more naive, a bit softer, a bit more enthralled spiritually and ideologically to women, whereas Jack Nicholson, it's just the physical thing, and he wants to be sort of sexually worshipped and satisfied constantly without any conditions attached. And his big blow up in the story is when Anne Margaret, who has basically fallen into a depression through their relationship and spends most of her time in bed, and she's sitting on the side of the bed crying, just saying, I want to get married, I want you to marry me. And it just sets him off on an explosive tirade, kind of full of accusatory rage at her deception, and he's just hurling insults at her. And it's kind of the id exposed, and the temper tantrum. This is not what I want. I want the benefits with none of the cost. And so it was kind of, it's a fascinating movie, and I think compared to maybe other movies of the time, it actually ages quite well, because there's a sort of a straightness to it. And the only thing that really dates it is some of the fashion. And at one point, Art Garfunkel and Jack Nicholson later in the movie are walking through the street, and Art Garfunkel basically says to him, I'm just getting some really bad vibrations from you, or you're giving off bad vibrations. And apart from that, most of the language used doesn't date it that much. I think there's a way of behaving that is maybe dated a bit, and the sexual politics as they played out within the social expectations of the time are a little bit, they look a bit quaint, but I guess we're meant to think that if that was college to middle age, I guess their college days were, I don't know, late 50s, early 60s. So everyone was a little bit more innocent. And Candice Bergen's character probably gets trapped in that milieu and doesn't get to, even though she's a very strong character on another level, when it comes to the sexual stuff, she's another woman being manipulated by, the sexual desire and the sort of the guilt-inducing behaviour of the spurned male lover. So, interesting and kind of fun and kind of brilliant in a way. I really like that movie. So one to go and find if you haven't seen it. Carnal Knowledge, great name as well for the movie. And yeah, I won't ruin the. I've thrown in a couple of spoilers there, but it's it's pretty clear. The story's opinion of the characters is quite clear by the end of it. They're both I don't know. It's it didn't feel inauthentic. It felt very believable, and I feel I've certainly had, at different times in my life, I've had variations of some of those conversations with different male friends, but maybe not for a long time. So it brings me to the next thing, and I've spoken at length on this podcast at different times about toxic masculinity, male attitudes to sex, my own attitudes to sex, to women. I've talked about my marriage carefully. I always try to be very respectful and mindful of my wife. Her mode is quite different to mine, and she doesn't always love the fact that I speak about some of these things on the podcast. So I try not to expose or implicate her too explicitly, because that just feels like bad form. That said, I have spoken pretty honestly about most of these things, and I just want to give a shout out to Mark O'Brien, the co-artistic director of the Abbey Theatre, the National Theatre here in Ireland, who he threw something up for International Men's Day on his Twitter feed, his X feed, which was basically, for International Men's Day, I think men should think about, or reflect on how you phrase it, but basically I think men should be reflecting on or thinking about vulnerability violence, and sexuality. And that was it. Nothing else attached. It didn't seem to get much traction, his comment, but I'm interested. Mark has commented at different times on areas of male behaviour and male violence, and I know Mark through work we did together years ago with Team Educational Theatre Company over 20 years ago. I had a lovely catch up with Mark earlier this year when I was doing the show with Broken Talkers Theatre Company as part of the What Does He Need collaborative arts project. Mark's a really good guy. I like where he comes from. I like his sort of artistic outlook. He's a solid individual. And so I'm always interested just to see what his little prompts are or what he's kind of putting out there into the world. And it's funny though, when he put out that text, my honest kind of initial reaction was one of, I felt there was an implied accusation, aimed at men. And my brain kind of just went to this kind of thing of, oh, here we go again. Here's and again, I'm just saying, I'm just being honest about my reaction. I'm not saying that this was Mark's intention, but I just felt like, oh, here we are. Yeah, men, we have to atone. And it was just an initial response. It was kind of a gut reaction. And then I just stepped away from it and went, hold on, let me just read that again. Like, there are three things that are worth reflecting on: vulnerability, violence, and sexuality. I mean, they're pretty big, and they're pretty central to human interaction. And then I just was like, very, very quickly, I feel quite clear about my own relationship to those things. I'm obviously a huge advocate of vulnerability as a core element of self-care and personal responsibility, as a core element of personal wellness. And I am a huge advocate of vulnerability in men. Finding a place where they can express vulnerability, finding a place where they feel it's safe to be vulnerable, because I think that is central to the male kind of negotiation of trauma, the male negotiation of their own wound, the male negotiation of areas of failure or areas of shame, areas where they feel they're being accused of not succeeding. And I think there's a relationship, that feeds into violence and sexuality, when vulnerability is not expressed safely, or vulnerability is not something that men embrace with confidence. But if I and I suppose that was the reason I spoke about carnal knowledge, because there's sexuality is really the driving force. Male sexuality is the driving force of that movie, of that story, of those two male characters. Vulnerability is in the mix as well, and violence not so much. It depends on our interpretation of violence, of course, because if you want to, I suppose misogyny is an expression of violence. It might not be physicalized, but there's a psychological and social violence. If that is the male mode of thinking of women, it's certainly, there is an implied violence in that, because women are objects of hate, and objects of derision, and And of course there there isn't. I mean, it's not, they don't necessarily go hand in hand, but of course there can be a relationship between misogyny and the sexual objectification of women. And I've spoken about that before as well, the idea of reducing women to sexual utility. That's something I have an issue with, as in I personally do not do that and it's not my issue to solve, but I'm saying when I encounter that mentality, I hate it. I find it, I mean, if I say I find it disgusting, it sounds like I'm getting a little bit, hysterical or reactionary. I mean, but I do. I find it very objectionable, and I find it sort of repellent, and it provokes in me an instant distrust of the man who expresses that, that attitude or that idea or belief. I find it so sort of boring. I find it so sort of dispiriting. I find it very immature, and I just don't trust it. I don't trust where it comes from, and it just feels that there's unaddressed stuff that is being masked by a sort of a lazy, offhand, and really kind of gross expression of chauvinism. But in any case, that's again, I've covered this territory before, and really what I wanted to get to today, which I'll cover now in the latter part of the episode, is I found myself reflecting on the idea of atonement in general. So not specifically tethered to male behaviour, but just as a general idea. And so I found myself asking the question, what do we owe whom, or to whom do we owe what, in terms of having to pay for something? Because I don't know about you, but when I think of atonement, I think of payment. And I suppose I also think of punishment. And I also think of the idea of atoning for one's sins or atoning for one's crimes. And if we stay in an area of criminal behaviour, if we stay in an area of breaking the law, if we stay in that area where we have a judicial system, and you have a penal system, and we have prisons and sentences to be handed down that are commensurate with the crime that's been committed, and in the absence of other options, and with a philosophical adherence to the desire for rehabilitation, I'm fine with all of that. And I know prisons are very flawed. They're very flawed. They are very flawed institutions generally, and there's huge rates of recidivism generally. But they're the best we can come up with in the absence of alternatives. So when I'm thinking of atonement, I'm thinking in more general terms and in more interpersonal terms, and maybe on individual terms as well. And if you look up, definitions of atonement, or just put in a general search online for atonement, two things come up predominantly. One is the Ian McEwan novel, which I've never read. The other is the film based on the Ian McEwan novel of the same name, Atonement, which I haven't seen, which starred James McAvoy and Keira Knightley and a very young Saoirse Ronan, which set her on the road to stardom. That film must be, is it 15 years old now? Very good movie, I believe, but again, I haven't seen it. So that comes up. And then you get the Christian definition, or the Christian legend or lore of atonement as it relates to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, the sacrifice of the Son of God for the sins of the people. He died for our sins, they tell us. As I've stated before, I am an atheist. I do not believe in this lore. I do not believe, and I spoke about this again earlier this year. I did an episode on original sin and how I reject the concept with every fibre of my being. So there may be a bit of crossover with some of my positions as they pertain to atonement. Because I read quite a few quotes from different figures, some clerics, some not, relating to the idea of atonement in the Christian context, and how, well, my understanding from what I read was, if you embrace and fully accept the idea of atonement as iterated or as symbolized by the crucifixion of Jesus, as symbolized by his sacrifice, the idea is that the way is now clear to enter the embrace of the Lord. So I don't feel any need for that personally, and I don't believe in a Lord to be embraced by. So it doesn't resonate with me. And also, I don't like the idea of vicarious atonement, that someone else gets punished for my crime, and I'm free. Like, that doesn't work for me. In my philosophy and my code of personal responsibility, if I've messed up and I owe someone payment in some way, and I'm speaking metaphorically, not literally, that's me. That's on me. That's on me to make that good. And that's about, and that's about it. For me, this is where I kind of go, okay, so if I go with that idea of I've transgressed in some way, and I've, like for argument's sake, I've caused someone offence, or I've done somebody a wrong, intentionally or not, what does reparation look like? What does recovery of that relationship look like? And can the process of trying to make it good, of trying to recover it, can that be described as atonement? And on the most basic level, is atonement reduced to the expression of regret, the expression of sorrow, the expression of contrition? And again, if you go back a bit further in the archives for the podcast, I did do a whole episode on forgiveness and contrition. I referred to this recently for some reason, because I did an episode looking at the aftermaths and the peacemaking processes after the Troubles in Northern Ireland, the conflict in Northern Ireland that ran mostly through the 70s and 80s, and also the peace and reconciliation process that happened in South Africa after the end of apartheid. And yeah, I was just looking at that idea, the relationship between contrition and forgiveness, and do you need to be forgiven to, for contrition to have meaning, or can you be contrite without being forgiven, and is that meaning enough? And so there is crossover into this idea of atonement. But I suppose my question is, well, to whom should we atone, and what should the nature of our atonement be? And is there any real merit in atonement that goes beyond the expression of genuine contrition? Because then it's no longer merely atonement; it is punishment. And it's interesting to conceive of this in a parenting frame and go, I feel like I've heard parents say about a child that's, and again, I'll use the word transgressed for the sake of simplicity. But I've heard parents say, in reference to a child who's transgressed, oh, they've suffered long enough. We'll let them come out of the dungeon. We'll let them come out of their room. We'll return their phone rights. We'll take them out for a treat. And it's an extraordinary power to wield over somebody, isn't it? And so let's take it away from, that example I think is very easy to grasp. But like, if you take it away from parenting and the idea that someone has to suffer and has to be seen to suffer before their right to well-being is restored, or before their right to feeling positive about themselves is restored. I find it kind of nebulous. I find it sort of, what is this about really? Like, whose needs are being met? And I suppose you can think of, again, it's probably just, my examples are crude and maybe it deserves more subtlety than this, but you might think, oh, I got really drunk and I threw up at the dinner party and my wife was really embarrassed, and then I had to atone for that. I'm just getting a flashback. Did I tell you this story before? I think I did tell you this story before. The story of the Christmas party. Now, my example I just gave before was a manufactured one, but it put me in mind of a night years ago, before my wife and I moved out to Australia. I was working as a substitute teacher in a local school in Wicklow. And there was a Christmas night out, and I was travelling half an hour, 40 minutes down the road it was a house party, dinner, drink. I was being driven by someone, and I left the house with the keys to my wife's car, and she had to go to a gig in Dublin. I did tell you this before, didn't I? And then she wasn't able to get to that gig because the keys to her car were in my pocket, and I'd hung my coat up when I got to the party, and I left my phone on silent in my coat because I was at a party and I wasn't there to be on the phone. And when I got back to the phone later that night, I was very drunk. There haven't been that many very drunk nights in my life, but this was one of them. And I had 20 missed calls from my wife and angry voice messages. And I was just ringing her drunkenly, telling her how much I loved her. And I got dropped back home late that night. And at that time we were living in an apartment block in Wicklow town. And there was a little side entrance, a gate through which I could get access to our apartment. And I walked through that gate and I threw up everything that I had eaten that night. And then I went home, I fell asleep. And I got up the next day. I had to teach. I went to school. And when I came home from school that day, I went up and I boiled kettles and I went out to wash what I had left on the path, off the path. And an elderly woman lived downstairs from us. She was a very nice woman. And she came along and saw me cleaning the path. She said, "Oh, you're so good. Oh, you're very good to clean that up. Oh, awful." And I was like, "Oh, I know, disgusting." I said, "Imagine." And of course I just let on that I had no idea where it had come from, but I was being a good Samaritan, cleaning up someone else's horribleness, someone else's failure to control themselves. Anyway, there you go. I just had a flash of that memory, and it was funny then, and it's funny now. So, and again, I have to say, I don't have any memory of my wife making me atone. I don't have any memory of her punishing me for that, although it still does come up every now and again in conversation, and I mean, I don't emerge well. There's no two ways about it. Although I will say, the reason my wife's car keys were in my pocket were because she had asked me to lift something heavy out of the car and bring it into the apartment before I left, which I did. So I was a good boy, but then I left with the keys. So then I was a bad boy. And maybe that comes back. Maybe that actually hits on what I'm talking about here. The whole idea of being good, being bad. One of the kind of foundational parenting lessons that is often put out there nowadays is never tell your kids that they're good or bad. Rather just discuss the behaviour or discuss the action or try to get to a place of understanding the implications of the behaviour. But, good and bad are two... I guess the concepts are too enormous and the implications of one or the other go too deep without real nuance. And I feel like I've read quite a bit and come across quite a bit the idea of being a good girl and how women will talk about the damaging effect on their agency, on their sense of independence, their sense of a kind of a sovereign right to have individuality can all be done away with by trying to conform to the expectations and rewarded behaviour of being in inverted commas, good girl. And something about that is people pleasing and the dampening down of prickliness or awkwardness or individual counter opinion, and it seems to be not uncommon for that to have been a very destructive dynamic in women's lives, in individual women's lives. And again, I've no issue with understanding that, and so again, we get into the kind of idea of good and bad, and you've been bad, you must atone, and I will decide on the nature of the atonement. I have a problem with it, because I think there's something excessive and disproportionate, if they're not the same words. Is that a tautology? But excessive... No, they're not. They're different. Excessive and disproportionate in terms of really and truly what's the need being met here. I mean, I said that earlier. Like, what is the need being met? Whose need is being met? And what is the nature of that need? I need to see sorrow. I need to see sorrow and guilt and contrition acted out in front of me for this amount of time. I find that concept absurd. Now, when I speak about these things, I try to kind of, in my mind, there's an imagined kind of scale or an imagined range of normal sort of, interpersonal / psychosocial or psychological bandwidth. There's a range that falls within normal parameters where people have an understanding of expectation socially, interpersonally, where people have an understanding of that's not really acceptable, that is acceptable. So I'm not talking about extreme cases where people are, pathologically wired very differently, or are unable to feel compassion, or are unable to consider consequences. Those are very particular cases, and I claim no expertise in those areas. So I'm generally when I speak about human behaviour, I'm speaking within very normal, experiential, seen and lived seen and lived ranges of experience in terms of how we behave and interact with each other. So what I was going to say was, like, the idea of someone having done something wrong and the sense of a need for consequences to maintain a healthy relationship, to maintain relational stability, to retain stability within a larger group of people, community, society. I don't really, I don't have an issue with that as a principle. But if I bring it back to just interpersonal, I think the idea of punishment and the idea of that kind of, that being the measure of atonement, that being the tool or the methodology of atonement, I really dislike. I think it's enough if you're dealing with this imaginary person within the normal bounds of behaviour. And again, I use these terms, in a cautionary, cautiously, understanding that normal has many different ways of being expressed. But you know what I mean. I'm not trying to kind of disown this, but I'm just putting that kind of caveat in there. I think it should be enough that the situation or the incident or whatever the transgression is, it should be enough that it is looked at, it's discussed, it's looked at with openness, with honesty, and then with the kind of the immeasurables, the unknowables, with genuine intention. With good, true intention, like good faith. I am really truly looking at this. I am truly looking at my behaviour. And then if there is an expression of contrition, again, that is deemed to be genuine, that's it. There's no need then for there to be ongoing, I hope you're still feeling sorry about that. Because what is that about? Like the person to whom the sorrow is being displayed, or for whom is being displayed. Like what's the what's the real benefit of that? I go back to what I said before. Like that just feels like such a gratuitous expectation, such a gratuitous display or wielding of power over another person. Okay, now you have permission to smile again. I have these flashpoints with my daughter. We both run a bit hot. Our personalities clash. We have these little squabbles, rows. And I understand from my wife's point of view, sometimes she'll look at us and go, it's like having two kids. Now, I don't accept that. I'm like, this is my relationship with my daughter. I'm very clear about my role as a parent, as a father. I try to be very consistent in terms of my parenting approach being in line with how my wife likes to do things as well. I feel that's better for our daughter. There's less ambiguity. I try to be supportive. But I'm very aware my personality is different to my wife's personality. How we interact with my daughter individually is very different. And so my daughter and I will have these flashes. And I mean, you've heard me many times now refer to, getting angry, being disappointed with getting angry, using a loud voice, shouting, being just, too big with that angry energy. And then, and I'm putting this in the context of how I parent my daughter, and then needing to own that and go back to my daughter and go, do you know what? I was wrong. You didn't deserve to be spoken to that way. That was me being angry about something else, and I didn't, maintain control, and this isn't on you, and I'm sorry. And that's it, and we deal with it. And then I just hope that this doesn't become a childhood trauma that surfaces later in life and comes back to haunt me, or has implications for relationships my daughter might have in her life as an adult. And I know that it probably will on one level or another, because that's how we are as people, and those are the effects and the impacts of parenting, and how we view relationships, how we view love, what we feel safe with, what we don't feel safe with. But to flip it back the other way, if my daughter comes to me and is apologizing for something, I often hear myself saying, it's okay, you don't need to apologize for that. We've dealt with it, and I'm not looking for an apology. Just acknowledge the behavior and, be aware that, I don't like it, or I don't approve of it, and let's move on. And I don't need my daughter then to wallow in guilt or to demonstrate to me that she is truly sorry. So I don't want to burden her with that. Yeah. Okay, so I don't know if I have anything else. Oh yeah, the only other thing I was thinking of in that area was atonement on an individual level. So then this is not interpersonal, this is just your own thing. And atonement, what does atonement look like there? I was thinking of it a bit in terms of discipline, personal kind of, self-discipline. For me, my relationship to exercise, that may have, it may have an element of atonement to it, because as I've discussed before, the way I exercise, and apart from, my Thursday night game of football with the lads, how are you lads? I don't think they even know I have a podcast. That's a group thing, that's social. I really, really enjoy it. And then I teach some karate and tai chi, and I have students to teach. There's a social aspect to that. But otherwise, the vast majority of my exercise is solo. Swimming, walking, doing my own, karate training, my own kind of tai chi, qigong, that kind of stuff, conditioning, solo. And sometimes I think this is my kind of the balancing element in my life. So if there are areas in my life where I'm failing, where I feel, for want of a better word, Jeannie Mac, I was going to say flaccid, flat. That's a very unfortunate word I chose there. But areas where I'm just simply not succeeding, where I'm lacking power, where I'm lacking impetus, where there's no energy, and again, just to go with it, where there's no thrust. When there are areas of my life where that's the case, and I feel I'm letting myself down, or I feel I'm letting other people down, the exercise that I do becomes a form of atonement. I mean, I'm just going to acknowledge that, like it does. And it's funny, I used to have a good laugh with a former colleague in America who, she was from America. She was a teacher I worked with in Melbourne. And again, I don't think she listens to the podcast, but on the off chance, hi Anne, how are you? And Anne was we were co-teachers. We had a lot of fun together. She was a former actress. We loved movies. But she was also a devout Christian and I think preacher. And so there was a sort of an ideological war that we occasionally, playfully, like in a good-natured way, we kind of, we jostled with each other and bristled against each other in certain areas of our kind of beliefs and convictions. But she used to laugh and tease me about my exercise and swimming, and she drew parallels with a sort of a monk-like asceticism, and sort of a self-flagellatory element to what I was doing, the cold water winter swims in the dark, in early morning in Melbourne. And yeah, I just laugh at it. And I mean, I took it in the spirit, with which it was intended. But I recognised an element of truth to it, which is also what made me laugh, because maybe there is a little bit of psycho in me when I put myself into the cold sea in the middle of winter. Now today I went to the sea, but it was too rough. I have a bit of a sore neck and shoulder, and I decided, you know what, no, it's okay, I can give this one a miss today. So I do that on occasion, and so the need to atone was not so strong today. But it's an interesting question, and I think it's an interesting concept. I think it's a pretty powerful concept, the whole idea of atonement and the place it might occupy in your life or in your mind. And if you are feuding or fighting with someone, do you feel that they should atone? It's very, to me, it's very kingly or godly to try and extract that from someone. You must atone for what you've done to me. There's a sort of a thirst for retribution, for revenge, the value of which I question, the value of which I sort of distrust. It doesn't. I don't know. If it's about I question the rehabilitative benefits of it. I question my right to expect that from anybody. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm happy to engage. If there's been problems, I welcome the expression of regret from people I care about. I welcome that. I welcome the expression of sorrow, of contrition, if that's what's required, or if that's what the other person feels is going to be of use to them. But like what I like, what I respond to is the gesture. What I respond to is the intention. I want to repair this. I want us to be good again. That's of so much greater value to me than any demonstration of guilt or an acting out of atonement. I'm like, I don't need that. Let's just pick up from here. And like, if we are understanding each other well, and if the intention feels authentic, and for me, that's energetic. You feel it. You feel the energy. When it's with people, you know when it's good. You know when it's true. You know when it's real, and that renewal of the journey in a better place. That's what counts, and what's gone is gone. And if I can't get over it, that's not about the other person. That's about me. And I mean, that's really important to note in all of this. If I'm still looking for atonement, it's much more about what I want and what I need, and not what the other person is doing or what they've done. It's, when will my desire for satisfaction be sated? What needs to happen? I'm just like, I feel very uncomfortable. I feel very uncomfortable around that. It's like, what's happening between us now, and is what's still available to us worth pursuing? And I think that's where I come back to. Are we continuing on this journey together? And how are we going to do that in a way that was better than it was yesterday? Because that's far more interesting to me than, than showing me how sorry you are for what's gone before, and, listing the wrongs, the injustices. It's like, okay, where are we now? What are you able for now that's going to take us to a better place? That's what I would offer as well. Do I need to be punished? Again, my brain goes to funny places. Punish me, please. Okay, sorry, that's an hour and 2, and I've got to get the hell out of here. Get out of Dodge, as they say. I'm done, and maybe you're done. Have you atoned? Do you feel the need to atone? Do you agree with me? Do you feel maybe it shouldn't have such an important place, or maybe it doesn't? Maybe I should ask Mark O'Brien what he thinks. Okay, that's it. I'm done for another week. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate you choosing this podcast, spending this time with me. I hope you got something out of it. I hope it provoked some thoughts. I hope it made you laugh, smile. I hope you leave this podcast with better energy than you entered it with. That's a good return, isn't it? That's a good exchange, a good transaction. Okay, I'm done. Take it easy, mind yourselves as always, and I will be back next week with something else. Take care. See ya. Bye.